and welcome to Western Civ, episode 199, John Calvin. Of the three early reformers, Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, John Calvin is easily the most influential, at least in terms of lasting influence. To an extent that has nothing to do with him. Calvin's writings would influence many key reformers, both in the Low Countries and in England. And many of those from England will find their way to what will become the United States of America, heavily influencing that country in turn. Calvin, however, unlike Luther or Zwingli, also sat down and decided what his doctrine and theology would be from a comprehensive perspective. Luther and Zwingli never did that, responding only to issues as they arose. Moreover, Calvin, unlike the other two early reformers, never sought reconciliation with the Roman Church. He believed, almost from the get-go, certainly by 1540, that such was impossible. He wanted to create a new, reformed Christianity. Calvin, consequently, was one of the few early reformers who actually created a complete understanding of what reformed Christianity would be. Bullinger and Melanchthon would do the same, but after the demise of Zwingli and Luther, respectively. Of the three early reformers, Calvin also had, somewhat amazingly, the best temperament, though I suppose this is a situation in which, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. He earnestly sought ways to find common ground with other reformers, unlike Luther and Zwingli, who seemed to actively court martyrdom at times. Calvin's path, as we are about to see, was also very unique. He joins the picture later than Zwingli or Luther, and is several decades younger. He was also a brilliant writer with a biting wit and a sharp, sarcastic sense of humor. Today, we begin his story. When I was yet a very little boy, my father had destined for me the study of theology. But afterwards, when he considered that the legal profession commonly raised those who followed it to wealth, this prospect induced him suddenly to change his purpose. Such were the words that John Calvin used to describe himself in 1543. Calvin did not discuss his formative years much, which was pretty typical for the age. When he did, he tended to describe himself as awkward, timid, and bashful. Calvin tended to see everything through the lens of the Bible. His great life's work would be to interpret the Bible for the Word. Through Scripture, he saw his own life mapped out. He was a prophet, a single-minded apostle, dedicated to that one cause and that one cause only. He did not consider his childhood in any way formative. It was a brief and brutal preparation for adulthood, associated, and again this was very typical of the age, with ignorance, volatility, and waywardness. Reading himself into Scripture, he would later compare himself to David, the shepherd boy destined to be king. Calvin wrote, "For although I follow David at a great distance, and come far short of equaling him, or rather, although in aspiring slowly and with great difficulty to attain to the many virtues in which he excelled, I still feel myself tarnished with the contrary vices. Yet, If I have anything in common with him, I have no hesitation in comparing myself with him. In reading the instances of his faith, patience, fervor, zeal, and integrity, it has, as it ought, drawn from me unnumbered groans and sighs that I am so far from approaching them. It has, however, been a very great advantage for me to behold in him, as in a mirror, both the commencement of my calling and the continued course of my actions, so that I know more certainly that whatever that most illustrious king and prophet suffered was exhibited to me by God as an example for imitation. How Calvin interpreted his own past through the Bible is, however, important and illustrative. The past, for Calvin, was to be reclaimed for the present. The Old Testament was to be reappropriated to remedy the corruption of contemporary society. The sources on Calvin's youth are sparse. To be fair, he wasn't even born John Calvin, but Jean Calvin, a name that was only later Latinized in Basel. He was born in Picardy in 1509, less than a decade before Luther penned his 95 Theses, making him the youngest of the three early reformers. The inhabitants of Picardy spoke Picard, close to but distinct from French. Calvin's father was an ambitious and industrious man, the family only having achieved bourgeois status in 1497. There were plenty of children in the Calvin family, but they were well off. Girard Calvin, Calvin's father, held a series of significant and prominent local positions. He was closely linked with the workings of the church, though his relations with the clergy were hardly easy. Calvin had his family's position as lesser nobility to thank for his education. But while he seemed at home with the nobility's assumption that it had the right to rule, he would later despise their addiction to material comforts. The most widely accepted narrative for the Calvin family of Calvin's youth was that they left the town of Noyon in 1523 for Paris, when John Calvin was 13 or 14 years old. In Paris, Calvin studied under the direction of Martin Cordier, a known and decorated humanist. At the time, it seemed unlikely that this young man and his much older, more renowned teacher would be linked. But such would be the case. In 1543, Cordier would be forced to leave Paris for Geneva, where he would come into contact with a much more powerful and confident Calvin. For 4 decades, the two men remained in contact, and it was one of the most enduring relationships of Calvin's life. At the end of 1523, John Calvin enrolled in the more prestigious Collège de Montaigu. In early years, Collège de Montaigu was known as a bastion of conservative scholarship, but had recently begun to embrace more humanist ideas. None other than Erasmus himself was one of the graduates of the college. Still, in terms of pedagogy, the university was downright medieval. Students were required to rise at 4 a.m., and their lessons began at 5. At 7, they heard Mass, and then had a meager breakfast of bread. From 8 to 12, there was instruction in the arts. Following another meal, the students practiced the art of disputation, kind of like debate. We've talked about it a lot at this point, under the watchful eye of their masters. There was an evening meal, more study and prayer, then bed at 9 p.m. This system of study instilled in Calvin a disciplined pattern that he would follow for the rest of his life. That being said, we still today don't know exactly what Calvin studied when he was at the college. The French religious world that Calvin grew up in was marked by conflict. Clerical education was poor, to say the least. Higher church offices were often held by unqualified members of noble families, and the religious orders were in disarray. The church itself was beset by a seemingly endless series of jurisdictional conflict between bishops, cathedrals, monastic houses, and universities. The endemic problem within the late medieval church was authority, namely, who had it and who didn't. Throughout the late Middle Ages, there had been paralyzing conflicts between the papacy and the French crown over who had the right to make most appointments. This was more or less resolved by the pragmatic sanction of Bourges in 1438, which effectively granted autonomy for the French church from Rome. Appeals to Rome were now forbidden until all legal processes in France were exhausted. The election of bishops, etc., was now firmly in the hands of the French chapters. You might think that this was a good thing for the French royal house, and in a way it was. However, the relative independence of the French church, which is referred to as the Gallic liberties, also heightened tensions between the king and the institutions of the church. Francis I had actually only recently strengthened royal control over the church in 1516, when he signed the Concordat of Bologna with Pope Leo X. While you might expect that that would mean that Francis would be fiercely loyal to Rome, he was also an avowed humanist, and his religious policy was nominally dictated by his foreign policy, rather than by any serious religious conviction. Devotional practices of all manners flourished in the late 15th century in France. The kingdom had been dramatically impacted by what historians refer to as the Northern Renaissance, driven in large part by Erasmus, probably the most influential European of the 16th century prior to Luther's emergence. Erasmus believed that Europe's pagan past was compatible with its Christian present. Then, in 1518, the Luther controversy arrived in France. Still, there's little evidence to suggest that Luther's movement in Germany had any major impact in the Kingdom of France prior to 1521, even though people were aware of it. Luther's writings were published in France, sure, but they were published in Latin, a fact which blunted their impact. There's some tangential evidence that his writings were translated into French prior to 1521, but any direct evidence has been lost. Still, it would be a mistake to think that Luther had the same direct, immediate impact in France that he did in Germany. In Germany, Luther became a sort of national hero, even though, of course, it's anachronistic to talk about Germany in a national sense in the 16th century. But in France, Luther was a foreigner. Now, that being said, a run of poor harvests in France between 1518 and 1522 made the population much more susceptible to reform ideas. Remember, we're still in an age when any sort of physical change in the earth is seen as some sort of a sign from God. So if the harvests are bad, well, that means, according to most people, God is angry. Maybe we should look into this reform thing. Now, instead of Luther, the Reformation in France begins with a humanist named, and again, I don't speak French, Jacques Lefebvre d'Estepes, a native of Picardy, like Calvin. It was Estepes, not Luther, who shaped the way that the French understood the unfolding Reformation. The French population only saw the Reformation through Estepes and his humanist lens. The French king, Francis I, now found himself in an awkward position. He was a humanist, sure. He was actually a good friend of Leonardo da Vinci. But his ministers were loath to accept humanism, and what they saw as the Trojan horse way that Reformed Christians were going to get into French society. The turmoil in the Swiss Confederation and the Peasants' War in Germany during the same period was a sobering lesson for King Francis. Many people believed that the Reformation should be about social, not simply religious reform. King Francis had no interest in political or social reform, however. Now, a lot changes after 1525, because in 1525, after the Battle of Pavia, which we're going to get into more in future episodes, King Francis finds himself a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, and his Catholic mother had to lead the realm. When Francis returned to Paris in 1526, he continued to support Reformed writers, but he wasn't willing to do any more, and he would certainly disappoint John Calvin throughout his life. Calvin's change from law to theology in the early 1520s has confounded historians since he did it, mostly because in his writings, he leaves us absolutely no reason as to when or why he made the switch. He didn't give us an aha moment like Luther or Zwingli did. No grand revelation. So all we can do is speculate. Law made sense for an ambitious and talented student like Calvin. But years later, in 1557, Calvin would claim that it was his father's idea for him to study law, not his. But again, this is Calvin writing 3 decades after he switched from law to theology. I think what we can say is this. In 1528, Calvin traveled to Orleans to begin his theological studies. We can date the change to roughly that time, but we don't know why. Orleans offered Calvin a lot educationally and personally. Calvin was in Orleans for a year, leaving for Bourges in 1529. But still, he made a circle of friends there that would remain close to him throughout his entire life. None of them, sadly, would accept the Reformation, though. We do know that Calvin was always assiduous in his studies. Quoting one later source here, he, Calvin, worked hard at his university studies, and there are still trustworthy men alive today who were on intimate terms with him at Orleans and who can testify that he often stayed up till midnight to study and ate hardly any supper in his eagerness for work. Each morning, when he woke, he would stay in bed for a few moments while he recalled to mind all that he had studied the previous day and mulled it over, so to speak. These years of study prepared Calvin for the rest of his life. Calvin would devote almost the remainder of his existence to the study of the Scriptures. He would rise early and often only retire late into the evening, working by candlelight. And he set the precedent for this life of intellectual ardor at an early age. In 1531, Calvin traveled to Nyon because his father was dying. At the same time, he began working on a new translation and commentary of Seneca's De Clementia. His choice of Seneca as a subject was significant. Seneca and his writings were central to humanism. Calvin would have been aware, no doubt, that none other than Erasmus had just completed his own commentary on De Clementia, which, by the way, in Latin just means of clemency. What did Calvin make of this text? Certainly, it was his first opportunity to show off all the skills he had developed over his years of legal study. His technical translation is beyond reproach. Grammar, syntax, perfect. But beyond that, Calvin adds scores of notes and commentaries, addressing everything from some of the more complicated philosophical points in the text to in-depth historical references. Immediately, Calvin's love of history is apparent, and I can certainly appreciate that. His ability to synthesize Seneca's writings within the scores of philosophers who preceded him is also impressive. If nothing else, Calvin's translation of De Clementia proves just how well read he was, even at a relatively young age. The manner in which Calvin analyzed Seneca is also important. He remained adamant throughout his translation that it was the job of the commentator to follow the flow of the text. He always went line by line. It would be the exact same method he would use when he examined the Bible. Calvin was very attracted to Seneca's Stoicism. Of course, I should note here that there was no such thing as quote-unquote Stoicism in the way that there was such a thing as Catholicism. The Stoicism of Epictetus is not the same thing as the Stoicism of Seneca or the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, for that matter. They're all different. A lot of these philosophical concepts are just kind of vague tenets and ideas that different people would ascribe practices to. It's not a sense of orthodoxy, I guess. Calvin appreciated Seneca's communal approach to virtue. The idea that clemency was a sort of bond for human society. That was something that really resonated with him. Calvin wrote, quote, "Clemency dwells indeed in every private house. It dwells, if you will, in poor huts and rustic cottages. When the father of the family conducts himself with moderation toward wife, children, and servants, and forgives, overlooks, is kind, and invites rather than compels them to do their tasks. On this account, Peter in his canonical epistle does not wish masters to be ill-tempered and hard on servants." End quote. Friendship also mattered to Calvin, as it did to Seneca. All his life, Calvin would define friendship in terms of a commitment to a common cause. Friendship, in its academic and personal form, was a defining feature of Calvin's worldview. Calvin's Seneca commentary was an expression of his self-confidence, and he took pride in its creation. During this time, Calvin was dependent on a minor patron, whom he deeply resented. He wanted to work on important work, not whatever his patron desired. Seneca had warned against obsequious pandering towards patrons, and Calvin got it. He realized that to have gifts meant having to use them and use them for a higher purpose. He would devote the remainder of his life to that idea. 1531, Calvin returned to Paris in the hopes of studying at the Collège Royal. He actually left Paris for Noyon to attend his father's funeral. In a weird, sort of prescient moment, as it turns out, Calvin's father would not be buried because he had died excommunicated. It seems the older Calvin fell out with the local chapter in the months before his death, and John Calvin, with his brothers, had to arrange for the posthumous reconciliation before his father could be laid to rest. This, as I alluded to, is of course all terribly ironic, given that Calvin would become one of the greatest leaders of the Reformation to tear down the Roman Catholic Church. After his father's funeral, Calvin did return to Paris, where he continued his studies, possibly learning Greek and Hebrew, two language musts for any future doctor of theology. From Paris, he went to Orléans again to continue his studies before disappearing from the historical record for over 18 months. But at some point in the fall of 1533, something changed. Up to now, Calvin had remained an ardent Catholic. But according to him, quote, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein, that although I did not altogether leave off other studies, I yet pursued them with less ardor. End quote. Later, Calvin would always assert that he had been born a Christian, raised a Christian, and would die a Christian. His rejection of Rome was never a rejection of Christianity. This was a switch in allegiance from Rome to the Word of God. Still, it was a very difficult time for him. Calvin found himself torn between loyalty to the church, a church he had every intention of joining someday, and a burning feeling that he was somehow abandoning God by adhering to Rome. He would later write of that period, being exceedingly alarmed at the misery into which I had fallen, and much more at that which threatened me in view of eternal death. I, duty-bound, made it my business to betake myself to your way, condemning my past life, not without tears and groans. And now, O Lord, what remains to a wretch like me, but instead of defense, earnestly to supplicate you not to judge that fearful abandonment of your word, according to its deserts, from which, in your wondrous goodness, you have at last delivered me. In language eerily similar to that of Martin Luther, Calvin wrote of the spiritual anguish he faced going into the decision. 20 years later, Calvin began to downplay this quote-unquote turmoil in his writings. But that was all long after the fact, and long after he established his Reformed Church in Geneva. It is easy to talk about a lack of pressure after you know it's going to turn out all right. My guess is that Calvin was indeed going through one of the most difficult moments of his life in 1533. The medieval church was the great institution of the Middle Ages. Turning your back on it, no matter that Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli already had, was still no small matter. I do not think that Calvin's later recollections indicate a change in what happened, and I certainly don't believe that he could not correctly remember. Calvin was recalling the same events, just from a new perspective. Crucially, Calvin would consistently argue that conversion, his conversion included, was the beginning, not the end of a journey. Calvin would write about his conversion a lot later in life, but mostly to hold himself as an example of how God works through individuals, not as an example of how conversions were required to take place. Calvin always realized he was different. He was destined to be a prophet. He was meant to be a leader. The biggest question remains, however, if Calvin was leaving the Roman Catholic Church, then what was he converting to? Luther was already established in Wittenberg around this time, so I suppose that's one viable option. Zwingli in Zurich was another, of course. Zwingli was dead at this point, but Bullinger is still there. Once more, our records get frustratingly vague, and we have little information about Calvin's actions for the next 6 months or so, until around the turn of the new year, 1534. It makes matters even more confusing that religion in France was even more chaotic and confused than it had been in 1520. There were Lutherans in France and members of Zwingli's Reformed Church, but there was actually a third option to which most reform-minded individuals clung to, and that was to reform the Catholic Church, not to get rid of it. Most humanists in France were still hoping that the Catholic Church would reform internally. Francis I found himself torn and isolated. He didn't support those within the kingdom who wanted to crack down mercilessly on Protestants and those humanists looking for the reform. But he didn't support the evangelicals either. Generally, his eye was on foreign policy, and that dictated his attitude toward religious dissidents in France. What I mean by this, and we'll get into this a lot more in later episodes, but Francis was always much more concerned with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V than with John Calvin, Martin Luther, or anyone else. Francis joined the Schmalkaldic League in an effort to undermine the emperor, but that didn't mean that he believed in Lutheranism or any Reformed theology for that matter, because he was also simultaneously named, quote, the most Christian prince, end quote, by the Pope, and he took that title seriously. Francis, as I mentioned, is a really fascinating person, and one that we'll turn to in maybe about the next 2 months in much greater detail. But for now, just know that while Calvin would look to Francis for support, Francis's heart is never really in Reformed theology. Still, we can only guess at what Calvin was doing in the winter of 1533-1534. Most of the historians I have read believe that he continued his studies. Several suggest he must have been reading Luther. Luther's works would have been available, and certainly Calvin read and understood Latin, so he could have read them. But if Calvin was reading them intently, he never mentioned it in any of his writings. The unrest in Paris continued, however. Catholics and Protestants agitated against one another and would continue to do so for, the next 100 years or so. This era was rife with outbreaks of violence, followed by royal crackdowns. And those factors are going to come into play now in John Calvin's life. Early in 1534, after briefly returning to Paris, Calvin abruptly left Paris, fleeing the city to stay with a wealthy family in the south of France. We cannot say precisely why he ran, but odds are it had something to do with his religion. But once again, I have to apologize, because there's a large gap in our sources during this period. There weren't any Protestant churches where Calvin fled to. Odds are he must have moderated his behavior and conformed in some ways, which is going to be terribly ironic, by the way, given his attitude later in life. But of course, to what extent he did this, we don't know. Several contemporary sources believed Calvin conformed to get along. If true, this would make Calvin a terrible hypocrite in later years. Now, of course, many of those sources are Catholic, so how much of that is slander? I can't say. For my part, I will say I think it's certain that Calvin would have had to have conformed to some degree. I just can't say how much. Calvin's increasingly radical evangelical views probably begin to coalesce during the winter of 1534. That winter, he would go back to Noyon for the last time. There, he renounced the benefice he had held since he was 12. Yes, as a member of the local elite, Calvin's father had long before purchased his son a benefice, the rights to the income of a local parish. This was extremely common at the time, even for the upper bourgeoisie. By renouncing the income, Calvin was formally turning his back on the church for the first time. I think that we can say up to 1534, Calvin was adhering to a version of Reformed Christianity that kept him in the church. Now, he was prepared to leave it behind. In October 1534, an event transpired in Paris that, while not involving Calvin directly, certainly impacted him: the placard affair. In the dead of night, October 17, 1534, a series of placards were placed around the city in a variety of locations, denouncing the Mass as an abomination. Most shockingly, one placard was found hanging on the king's own bedchamber door. Whoever was behind the incident could reach far, indeed. As you might expect, the royal reaction was swift. Royal officials seized Protestant books and arrested nearly 50 Protestant leaders, executing 9. When it happened again, in January 1535, Francis was even harsher. He only relented to appease his Lutheran allies in Germany. Sacramentarians, followers of Zwingli, on the other hand, did not get a reprieve. Still, the incident revealed to every Protestant in France, including John Calvin, the extent of the connection between the royal French house and the Catholic Church. The radical Catholics in France had now been given carte blanche to prosecute their enemies. The bishops of France were soon parading their relics through the streets, trailed by officials wearing royal livery. The optics were difficult to mistake. Ironically, the man behind the placard fiasco was a Frenchman currently in exile in Geneva. He escaped punishment. Calvin would flee Paris first to Orléans and then to the Swiss city of Basel. Before we move on, I want to address that there was one important exception to the rule in France. The rule that France was Roman Catholic and that Protestants were destined for persecution. The exception is the Kingdom of Navarre. The Kingdom of Navarre, along the Pyrenees in the far southwestern corner of France, was one of those patchwork medieval kingdoms that maintained its formal independence from France, while its ruler formally paid homage to the king in Paris. This is exactly as it had been in Aquitaine and Normandy in the days of the Angevin Empire. Navarre would very shortly become a part of France under the personal union of the future Henry IV, King of France. But that's a story for another day. For now, what you need to know is that Navarre was an oasis of toleration, trapped between two juggernauts of religious oppression, France and Spain. Marguerite, the Queen of Navarre, was a firm supporter of reform within the church and surrounded herself with individuals who believed that Erasmus was right. This was where many French Protestants fled before Calvin established himself in Geneva. And the Kingdom of Navarre is going to feature more prominently in our story from this point forward. As Calvin traveled south to the Swiss Confederation, he wrote, and increasingly, his writings covered one topic and one topic only: the Bible, the Word of God. In these writings, Calvin stressed the role of the Christian as a pilgrim, a theme he would return to later in life. Calvin believed that two of the best models from the Old Testament were Abraham and Job, two men who suffered for God, but did not, in the case of Job, question him. Calvin believed that death was never something to be feared. Death was part of being a Christian. What mattered was never losing your faith, never giving in. Life was a pilgrimage. If Job was Calvin's model for suffering, then Abraham was his perfect model for the perfect man of faith. He wrote, "The apostle speaks of Abraham and his posterity, who dwelt in a foreign land among strangers, not only as exiles, but as sojourners, scarcely sheltering their bodies by living in poor huts, in obedience to the command of God given to Abraham, that he should leave his land and his kindred. God had promised them what he had not yet exhibited. Therefore, they trusted the promise afar off and died in the firm belief that the promises of God would one day be fulfilled. In accordance with this belief, they confessed that they had no fixed abode on the earth, and that beyond the earth was a country for which they longed: heaven." Now, as I'm going to get into in future episodes, this concept of exile for your faith is absolutely central to understanding Calvinism. And so it's really important to understand how he is drawing it from his readings of Abraham at this point. Critically, Calvin expanded out the idea of the pilgrimage from one person to a whole people, to an elect. Just like Zwingli, Calvin believed that he was leading God's chosen people. On the road to Basel, he wrote with passion, "So that we may be permitted to say in baptism, our Pharaoh is drowned, our old man is crucified, our members are mortified. We are buried with Christ and removed from the captivity of the devil and the power of death, but removed only into the desert, a land arid and poor, unless the Lord rain manna from heaven and cause water to gush forth from the rock. For our soul, like that land without water, is in want of all things till he, by the grace of his Spirit, rain upon it." To Calvin, going into exile was the same thing as going on a pilgrimage. Life was a transformation. You had to trust God and you had to suffer when needed. And crucially, you couldn't turn your back on the Word of God. If the authorities asked you to, then you had to go into exile. 1534 remains probably the most intriguing year of Calvin's life. We know a lot about what happened, but much remains shrouded in mist. We know that he studied, preached, and moved within a circle of sympathetic friends. Still, he was largely a loner. There is every reason to believe that Calvin had begun crafting his theological system in 1534. He might even have had a draft of his famous Institutes in his hand as he traveled south. But next week, we'll dig into the Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin's most important and enduring work. Next time, Calvinism begins to form in earnest. Until then, if you're interested in more content, as always, check out the website, link in the show notes, and consider becoming a patron. For $2 a month, you get access to tens of hours of bonus content and deep dives, including one on John Wycliffe, the predecessor to Calvin, Luther, et al.